Lena stepped off the bus with a light backpack and a tired face, not realizing that the little town she had landed in would test her in a strange and unexpected way. The sky held the last colors of the late afternoon, and the streets were starting to glow with warm lights from stores and cafes. She tightened her scarf around her neck as a cool wind brushed past, making her stomach remind her again loudly that she had not eaten since morning. Her plan had been simple: change buses at the main station and keep moving east. But delays, closed counters, and a mix-up with schedules had left her stranded for the night. She tried not to worry. She had been on the road for months now, drifting from one small town to another, playing piano whenever someone let her. She was used to uncertainty. Still, the hunger pressing at her was sharp. She had spent the last of her money 2 days earlier on a cheap room, and a breakfast that barely held her through a long walk. She told herself she would find a place to rest. Maybe ask around about a shelter or a small inn that took late walk-ins. But right now, she needed food. Even a bread roll or a bowl of soup would feel like heaven. She walked down the street, letting the warm glow from a cafe window pull her closer. Inside, she could see people talking and laughing, their faces relaxed after long workdays. Someone was tuning a guitar on a small stage near the corner. A piano and upright, old but cared for, stood beside it, a soft lamp aimed at its polished surface. The sight of the piano made her slow down. She had played on hundreds like it, some better, some much worse. But it looked inviting, familiar. She put her hand on her stomach again, trying to quiet the ache as she pushed open the door. The cafe was cozy, filled with the smell of baked bread, warm spices, and something sweet, maybe cinnamon. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in. Her hunger sharpened instantly. The owner stood behind the counter, wiping glasses and chatting with a group of regulars. He was broad-shouldered, with a friendly but tired expression. A couple of workers hurried around behind him, filling cups and handing out plates of hot food. Lena walked toward the counter, feeling a mix of hope and embarrassment. She didn't like asking for help. It always made her feel like she was taking more than she deserved. But tonight, she didn't have much choice. The owner noticed her and offered a polite nod. "Evening. You need a table?" She hesitated. "Actually, I was wondering about something else." He raised a brow, waiting. "I don't have money right now," she said softly. "But if it's possible, could I play the piano for a little while? Maybe in exchange for a meal?" Her voice barely rose above the mixed conversations around them, but the workers nearby heard her. One of them, a young man with a towel over his shoulder, shot her a quick look, then smirked as he carried plates away. Another worker whispered to a girl arranging the pastry trays, and she glanced over at Lena with a doubtful expression. The owner didn't laugh, but he looked surprised. "You want to perform for food?" "Yes, only if it's all right," Lena said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just one meal. I can play well." A couple sitting close to the counter heard the exchange. The man raised an eyebrow and leaned closer to whisper something to his partner, who glanced at Lena and tried not to smile. Near the stage, the musicians who had been setting up earlier turned their heads. They were adjusting their guitar case and sorting cables, but now their attention shifted toward her. One of them, a tall young guy wearing a faded jacket, let out a small laugh. "We've seen this before," he muttered to his friend, not quietly enough. "Someone thinks they can play just because they know chopsticks or something." His friend snickered, pretending to shiver dramatically. "Oh no, the mystery prodigy has arrived." Lena heard every word. Her ears warmed, but she kept her face calm. She had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. The owner looked from her to the musicians, and then back at her again. He sighed, not unkindly. "Look, We usually have scheduled performers on weekends. Tonight they're rehearsing. We don't really do swaps. I understand, she said, her voice softening. But I won't take long. Just a few minutes. If you don't think it's good, I'll stop right away. The owner studied her face. Something in her eyes, maybe the exhaustion, the sincerity, or the hunger she tried to hide, made him pause. He scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, he said slowly, it's early. Not many people are here for the music yet. Playing for a couple of minutes won't hurt anyone. Before he could finish, the tall musician laughed again. Yeah, let her try. Might be entertaining. His friend added, I'll bet $1 she barely knows where middle C is. The comment stung, but Lena forced herself to breathe. She wasn't here to argue with anyone. She was here because she needed food, because her stomach felt so painfully empty, and because she trusted the piano more than anything else in her life. The owner gestured toward the stage. All right, go ahead, but just for a short bit. After that, we'll see. Thank you, she said quietly. She walked toward the piano, feeling the heat of every stare settling on her back. Some customers watched with curiosity, others with amusement. A couple simply ignored the situation entirely. The musicians leaned against a table, arms crossed, ready to be entertained by what they thought would be a disaster. Lena slipped off her backpack and placed it carefully beside the piano bench. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the fallboard, exposing the keys. The piano smelled faintly of polish and wood. She touched the surface gently, the way someone might greet an old friend. She sat down, settling slowly, letting the weight of the moment press into her. She hadn't eaten, she was exhausted, and she was surrounded by people expecting her to fail. But none of that mattered now. The moment her fingers met the keys, everything else would fall away. It always did. She placed her hands lightly on the keyboard and closed her eyes for a brief second, letting her breathing even out. The cafe's sounds chatter, clinking dishes, quiet laughter blurred into a soft curtain around her. She pulled in one last calming breath. Before she played a single note, the tall musician called out, Hey, try not to break anything. His friend added, Yeah, just hit the white keys. That's usually a good start. Lena didn't react. She didn't even look up. She let her fingers hover, feeling the familiar spacing of the keys. Her father used to say that a piano always spoke first. The musician just had to listen. She had grown up believing that, and right now, she needed the piano to speak for her louder than ever. She pressed the first note. A soft, warm tone filled the air gentler than anyone expected, but clear and steady. The cafe's noise dipped slightly, a few heads turning. She pressed another note, then a third, shaping a slow, delicate pattern. Her hunger tugged at her again, but she pushed through it. She let her fingers glide into a calm melody, something simple at first, something honest, the kind of tune that felt like stepping into a quiet memory. She didn't want to impress anyone right away. She wanted to feel the piano breathe with her dot as she played. She forgot for a moment about the bus delays, the cold wind outside, the mocking voices behind her, and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She forgot about everything except the keys beneath her fingertips. The cafe began to hush. A couple near the window leaned forward. A server paused mid-step, balancing a tray in her hands. Even the workers behind the counter went still. Lena didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could sense the shift in the air of the familiar, quiet pull that always came when a piano started speaking to people in a way they didn't expect. And for the first time that day, she felt a small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she would earn more than a plate of food tonight. Maybe she would earn a moment of dignity too. Lena kept playing, letting the soft melody flow from her fingers. and for a few moments the cafe seemed to breathe with her. But the moment she lifted her hands from the keys, the spell faded. Conversations rose again, chairs moved, and plates clinked as if nothing special had happened. A few people nodded politely, but most returned to their meals. The owner gave her a small gesture, the kind that meant not bad, but also nothing too exciting yet. The musicians near the stage didn't look impressed at all. The tall one smirked, crossing his arms again. "That's it," he said. "Thought we were in for something dramatic." His friend chuckled. "Yeah, maybe the finale is when she asks for dessert too." The two shared a laugh, loud enough for half the cafe to hear. A few customers looked over with mild amusement, waiting to see what would happen next. Lena lowered her head slightly, not from shame, but from a quiet sort of sadness-regret that people often judged before they listened. She wasn't trying to impress anyone with a warm-up. She just needed to settle into the piano's feel. But clearly they expected something else. The owner folded his arms over his chest. "All right," he said, trying to stay neutral. "Do you have something more upbeat?" "People here like lively music." Lena nodded. "I can play something different." Without waiting for approval, she placed her fingers back on the keys. This time she began with a firmer touch, pressing into the notes with a little more strength. The melody she played now was brighter and quicker. It danced across the keyboard with playful jumps and sharp turns. Several customers perked up, tapping their feet lightly. A family near the front stopped eating to watch her hands move. Even the servers paused while setting down plates, but the tall musician wasn't convinced. "She's got some skill," he admitted under his breath, "but it's nothing special. Just basic stuff." His friend shrugged. "Anyone can learn that with a few years of lessons." They stood with an air of careless confidence, certain they knew more than they did. Lena didn't hear their words, but she felt the weight of their judgment. It wasn't new to her. Traveling alone had taught her that people often spoke without thinking. They didn't know who she was, where she came from, or what she had lived through. They couldn't know the hours she had spent at worn-down pianos in bus stations, community halls, and tiny inns. They didn't know the years she had practiced under her father's gentle guidance, or how deeply music was woven into her memories of him, but she didn't need them to know. She only needed them to listen. She finished the lively piece with a soft flourish and glanced toward the owner. He looked unsure, not disappointed, but not convinced either. "It was good," he said. "But we usually serve a big dinner crowd around this time. They like strong, familiar tunes. Something they can hum along to." Lena nodded again. She didn't argue. She never argued. Instead, she rested her hands gently on the keys, thinking for a moment. The room waited, some with mild curiosity, some with impatience. She began a new tune, one that carried a deeper echo, fuller and more expressive than the first two. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. But each note felt like it had a purpose. Her fingers glided with a confidence that seemed to rise from somewhere old and buried. Slowly the cafe grew still again. People leaned forward. A woman holding a steaming cup of tea froze with the cup halfway to her lips. A boy sitting with his parents turned in his seat, watching with wide eyes. Even the owner's expression softened, his eyebrows lifting slightly. But the musicians refused to be moved. The tall one cleared his throat loudly on purpose, trying to break her concentration. His friend drummed his fingers unkindly on the table. They weren't used to being overshadowed, even in rehearsal. Lena didn't let their noise disturb her. She played on, letting the piano lead her. She closed her eyes briefly as the melody widened and softened, a rhythm that felt like walking through a memory she had long feared to revisit. When she opened her eyes again, a woman standing near the counter had tears forming in them. Another customer whispered to someone beside him, pointing at her hands, and for the first time, The tall musician's smile wavered. He shifted uncomfortably, looking at his friend for reassurance, but his friend avoided meeting his eyes. They didn't want to admit it, but something about the way Lena played, something about her quiet steadiness, it unsettled them. She finished the piece with a long, gentle note that faded into silence. No one clapped this time, not because they didn't like it, but because clapping felt too harsh for the fragile moments she had created. Then, slowly, softly, the room breathed out. A few people murmured compliments. Someone said, "That was beautiful." A woman nodded with a thoughtful smile. The owner seemed surprised by his own reaction. He rubbed his hands together and nodded once. "That was nice," he said. "You have a real touch." But before Lena could respond, the tall musician suddenly pushed off the table, forcing a louder tone into the quiet moment. All right, he said with forced cheer. "Let's give her a break. Maybe she knows a few tunes." But playing on a cafe piano doesn't prove much. Anyone can learn those if they practice enough. A few customers frowned at his rudeness, but he didn't seem to notice. His friend stood straighter, trying to regain the confidence they'd lost. "Yeah," he added. "No offense, but we've been playing here for months. The crowd comes for our music, not to hear strangers wander in." A few customers glanced at each other, sensing tension. Lena looked at the two musicians, her face unreadable. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. She had already learned that people who spoke the loudest were rarely the ones who listened. The owner tapped the counter lightly, trying to keep things peaceful. "Let's keep it respectful," he said, though his voice lacked firmness. He glanced back at Lena. "Do you have one more piece? Something strong? Something that shows your full ability?" She hesitated. She knew what he meant. He didn't want warm-ups or gentle tunes. He wanted something powerful, something that made people stop eating entirely, something that left no room for doubt. She had pieces like that, pieces she had learned from her father, pieces she rarely played in public because they carried too much memory, too much weight. But she also knew this was her chance, maybe her only chance to earn a meal tonight. She placed her hands on the keys again, colder now from the nerves creeping up her arms. She took a slow breath, grounding herself. Her thoughts flickered to the nights she had practiced beside her father, his steady voice guiding her. She remembered how he used to say that music wasn't about showing off, it was about telling the truth. So she would tell the truth tonight, even if no one in the room understood it. She began with a strong chord, rich and full. A few people jumped slightly at the sudden depth of sound. Then she moved into a swift series of notes, weaving them with precision and emotion. It wasn't a famous tune. It wasn't something anyone could hum along to. But it had a story inside it, one that held both strength and sorrow. The musicians froze, not because they respected her, but because they couldn't look away. Her hands moved faster than before, yet nothing felt rushed. Every note was placed with intention. Every shift in tone felt like a step into another room of her memory. As the melody grew, the cafe fell silent again. Complete silence. Even the kitchen noise faded as workers paused behind the counter. The owner leaned forward, stunned. A customer near the window whispered, "Who is she?" Lena's hair slipped slightly over her shoulder as she leaned into the final passage. Her fingers moved with such grace and certainty that a few people unconsciously held their breath. She ended the piece with a soft, trembling note that hung in the air longer than it should have. The silence afterward was heavy, not awkward, just full. Full of something no one could quite name. Finally, someone clapped, just one person. But then another joined. Then another. Soon the entire cafe applauded, some louder than others, but all showing an appreciation that had not been there before. Even the owner clapped with genuine surprise. The tall musician looked pale. His friend's mouth hung open. Lena didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply rested her hands in her lap, breathing quietly, trying not to let the emotion rise too quickly. She had not played that piece in months, and the memory it carried pressed hard against her heart. The owner stepped forward. "You weren't joking," he said. That was honestly amazing. He rubbed his forehead, trying to piece things together. "You'll get your meal." "Of course, but now I have to ask, where did you learn to play like that?" Lena looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly. She could have told him the truth, that her father had been a legendary pianist, a man whispered about in the world of classical music, but she wasn't ready to share that part of herself. Not yet. Instead, she simply said, "I've been playing since I was young." The owner nodded, accepting the simple answer, even though he sensed there was more doubt in the corner. The musicians stood frozen, their earlier confidence shattered, and Lena, tired and hungry, but finally hopeful, waited quietly to see what the night would bring next. Lena sat quietly at the piano bench long after the applause faded, trying to steady the slow shaking in her fingers. She didn't know if it was from hunger, nerves, or the old memories that the last piece had stirred awake. She kept her eyes lowered as she folded her hands together, letting the softness of the piano's wooden edge press against her palms. The cafe around her buzzed again with life, but it felt different now, gentler, warmer, as if the music she had played had changed something in the air. A few customers drifted closer, some offering quiet compliments before returning to their tables. The owner moved behind the counter again, almost too stunned to speak, but he watched her with a new kind of attention. Even the workers, who had earlier exchanged amused looks at her request, now whispered to each other with wide eyes. But the musicians, the two who had laughed at her before, stood stiffly beside their equipment. Their smirks were gone. Their confidence had cracked. The tall one picked up his guitar case with a shaky hand, trying to pretend nothing had changed. But the way he avoided looking at her said everything. Lena didn't resent them. She wasn't angry. She had learned long ago that judgment came easily from people who expected the world to be simple. People didn't see her past, the years of training, the nights spent playing beside her father, while he corrected her hand position with patient words. They didn't know her mother had passed away when she was very young, leaving her father as her only guide. They didn't know how often he used music to speak the things he didn't know how to say out loud. She touched one of the keys again lightly, barely pressing it, and a soft note rang out, thin and lonely. It reminded her of him, and suddenly her chest tightened in a way she didn't expect. She remembered those early mornings when the sun had barely risen, and her father would sit beside her at the grand piano in their small living room. He was quiet, always quiet, but music poured from him like it was the only language he ever needed. His hands moved with a grace she had never seen in anyone else. Even when she was too young to understand the weight of his talent, she knew he was different. He used to say, "Listen before you play. The piano will tell you what it needs." Most children grew up hearing bedtime stories. Lena grew up hearing lullabies played on the keys, each one carrying a piece of her father's heart. He never pushed her to learn, never demanded perfection. Instead, he let her grow into the music naturally, teaching her gently, step by step, as if you were guiding a bird toward its first flight. By the time she was 10, she could play pieces that adults struggled with. But her father never showed her off. He never talked about his own fame, the concerts he once gave, or the halls that once overflowed with people waiting to hear him. He kept all of that far from her, choosing a quieter life after losing his wife. Music became something soft between them, a bond, not a stage. When Lena was older, she found out by accident who he really was. She had come across an old newspaper clipping hidden between the pages of a book, a photo of him performing at a grand hall, the headline praising him as one of the greatest pianists of his generation. When she asked him about it, He only smiled and said, "That was a different time." He never wanted his past to shape her future. He wanted her to play from truth, not pressure. But he died when Lena was still young enough to need him. The loss felt like someone had taken the sound out of the world. She stopped playing for months, unable to touch the keys without thinking of him. The piano bench felt too empty without his calm presence beside her. It was only when she dreamed of him one night, sitting at the piano, looking at her with that quiet, steady patience he always had, that she found the strength to return to it. She started with the simple pieces he had taught her as a child, and each note felt like a small stitch mending something in her heart. Now, sitting in this cafe in a town she didn't even know the name of, she felt the old ache rise in her again. Playing his style, playing the pieces he had helped her shape, always brought him back not as a ghost or a sorrow, but as a warm echo. A server approached her carefully, holding a plate filled with warm food. Her expression carried none of the earlier doubt. "This is for you," she said softly. "The owner said you earned it." Lena smiled gratefully, the smell of the food almost overwhelming her. She thanked the server and placed the plate on a small table beside the piano. Her stomach tightened with hunger, and for a moment her eyes watered not because of the food itself, but because of the kindness behind it. She took a slow bite, savoring it. Warmth spread through her body, easing the hollow feeling that had followed her all day. It tasted better than anything she'd eaten in weeks, maybe because she had earned it through something that mattered to her. As she ate, she noticed a man near the back of the cafe watching her. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with gentle eyes and gray hair that curled slightly around his ears. He had been listening intently from the moment she played the last piece. Now he stood up slowly and approached the stage with cautious steps. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her. His voice was soft, respectful. Lena nodded. He sat down, resting his hands on the edge of the table. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he asked, "Who taught you to play like that?" His question wasn't like the one the owner had asked. This man wasn't curious in a casual way. He wasn't impressed by talent alone. He sounded as if he recognized something deeper, something familiar. Lena looked down at the table, thinking carefully. "My father," she said. The man nodded. "He must have been very skilled. Your technique? Your emotion. It's not something you learn from a regular teacher." She shrugged slightly. "He was good." The man leaned back, studying her face with quiet attention. "Good is too small a word," he said. Then, after a moment, he added, "Your phrasing, the way you shape the melody. It reminded me of someone I heard many years ago. Someone remarkable." Lena's heart tightened. She looked away, folding her hands in her lap. The man continued gently, "I once attended a performance by a pianist named Adrian Cole. Maybe you've heard of him?" Her breath caught. She looked at him slowly, unable to hide the flicker of surprise in her eyes. The man nodded softly. "Yes, that same depth, that same touch. Music that feels like memory itself." He tilted his head. "You play exactly like him." Lena swallowed, unsure how to respond. She had always tried to hide her connection to her father, never wanting to draw attention or be compared to him. She traveled quietly, played quietly, lived quietly. Fame had destroyed too many lives, and she didn't want to be part of that world. The man watched her carefully. "Are you related?" She hesitated, then nodded once. "He was my father." The man breathed out slowly, as if something long suspected had just been confirmed. "I knew it," he said, "the moment you touched the keys." Their conversation stayed quiet, private, almost fragile. He spoke about the concerts he had seen, the way people had always described Adrian Cole's performances, not with excitement, but with emotion, as though he had touched their hearts more than their ears. Lena listened. trying not to let tears form. Hearing her father's name spoken kindly always touched something deep inside her. She had spent so many years trying to disappear from the world his talent had once shaken. And yet, here it was still finding her. After a few minutes, the man stood up again. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me of a musician I thought I'd never hear echoes of again." She nodded lightly, unable to speak. When he walked away, she felt a strange blend of sadness and gratitude. She rarely told anyone who she was. But sometimes, in moments like this, it felt okay. It felt safe. The cafe slowly returned to normal as night settled outside. The owner announced that the musicians would begin their rehearsal again, though the two looked shaken and unsure of themselves. They avoided looking at Lena entirely, too embarrassed by their earlier comments. She finished her meal slowly, appreciating every bite. The warmth in her chest lingered not from the food alone, but from the music still echoing inside her dot when she finally stood to leave. The owner approached her with a careful smile. "You're welcome back any time," he said. "Not just for food. If you ever want a place to play, the stage is yours." She thanked him quietly, slipping her backpack over her shoulder dot as she stepped outside into the cool night. She felt the wind brush gently across her face. The street lamps glowed softly, and the town around her seemed less strange, less unfamiliar. She didn't know where she would travel next. She rarely did. But this night had reminded her of something important, something she often forgot while drifting from place to place. She wasn't just a traveler. She wasn't just someone passing through towns. With a worn backpack and empty pockets, carried a legacy, even if she tried not to. A gift her father had given her. A voice that spoke through the piano keys. Honest and clear dot as she walked toward the dim street ahead. She felt her father's presence beside her, not in a haunting way, but as a quiet warmth that echoed with each step she took. She didn't know what tomorrow held, but for tonight she felt full, not just from the meal, but from the memory of who she was and where she came from. The next morning came quietly, with pale sunlight slipping through the thin curtains of the small room Lena managed to rent for the night. She had found it after wandering through the empty streets for almost half an hour, asking at two places before finding one that had a late-night desk clerk who didn't mind accepting a small discount in exchange for simple chores. She had swept the lobby floors and folded towels until her arms ached, but she didn't mind. It gave her a place to sleep, and after everything that had happened at the cafe, she needed rest more than anything. She woke up slowly, her thoughts still tangled with the emotions from the night before. Her father's name echoing through the cafe, the unexpected applause, the soft warmth in her chest, it all felt unreal. For months she had been drifting, unsure of her direction, playing wherever she could for enough money to keep moving. But last night reminded her that even in the smallest corners of the world, the music she carried could still find a home. She sat up and stretched her arms over her head, feeling the stiffness in her shoulders. The room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a window that looked out onto the quiet street. A couple walked by outside, chatting softly. A dog trotted along beside them, stopping to sniff the ground. Everything felt calm. After washing up and tying her hair back neatly, she packed her things and stepped out into the hallway. The building was quiet, with only distant sounds of someone vacuuming on another floor. When she reached the front desk, the clerk thanked her again for the help from the night before, and she thanked him for the room. She left with her backpack slung over her shoulder, the morning breeze brushing gently against her face. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but she found herself drawn back toward the cafe. Something about the place still lingered in her mind. Maybe it was the piano, maybe the owner's kindness, Or maybe the unexpected recognition from the older man who had compared her to her father. Whatever it was, she felt pulled toward it. As she approached the cafe, she heard soft music drifting through the open doorway. Someone was playing a guitar inside slow, uncertain notes that sounded like warm-up practice. She stepped inside quietly. The cafe looked different in the morning light. The warm glow from the lamps was replaced by sunbeams shining across the tables and walls. A few early customers sat with steaming cups of coffee, reading newspapers, or scrolling on their phones. The owner stood behind the counter, preparing the day's first batch of pastries. He noticed her almost immediately and lifted a hand in greeting. "Good morning," he said. "You're up early." Lena smiled politely. "I slept well. Thank you. For the meal, too." "You earned it," he said with a nod. "People were still talking about your playing after you left. You made quite an impression." She shrugged lightly, not knowing what to say. She didn't play for praise. She played because music was the one thing that still felt like home. Near the stage, the two musicians from the night before stood beside their equipment. They looked less confident today, more aware of their own mistakes. When they noticed her, they stiffened. The tall one touched the strings of his guitar nervously, as if unsure whether to acknowledge her. His friend nudged him under the table, whispering something Lena couldn't hear. After a moment, the tall musician cleared his throat. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "About last night. We were kinda rude." His words were stiff, uncomfortable, but genuine enough that Lena gave him a small nod. "It's all right," she said softly. He shifted from one foot to the other, not quite meeting her eyes. "It's just most people who walk in asking to perform for food. Well, they're not exactly, you know." His voice trailed off. Lena didn't hold it against him. She understood. The world wasn't always gentle, and people learned to protect themselves in strange ways. Humor, doubt, distance. "I know," she said. "It's fine." His friend stepped forward, looking down at the floor. "You're really good. Better than, well, better than anything we've heard around here." The owner overheard the exchange and looked over with raised eyebrows. It wasn't often that those two admitted they were wrong about anything. "Actually," the owner said, wiping his hands on a towel, "I was hoping you'd come by today. If you're staying in town a little longer, maybe you'd consider playing here again? Not for food this time. For an actual performance spot." Lena blinked. She hadn't expected that. "For a set," he continued. "This weekend? I'd pay you the same rate I pay the others. Maybe more." The musicians exchanged a quick glance, startled. The tall one opened his mouth as if to protest, but then closed it again when he caught the owner's firm expression. Lena hesitated. She didn't usually stay in one place for long. Moving helped her escape the attention that always followed when someone recognized her father's style. But the offer was kind, honest, and there was something peaceful about this town, something that felt safe. "I'm not sure how long I'll be here," she admitted, "but maybe I can stay for a few days." The owner smiled. "That's all I ask." Just then, the cafe door opened, and the older man from the previous night stepped inside. He carried a small satchel and wore a warm smile as he approached the counter. When he saw Lena, his face brightened with recognition. "Ah, there you are," he said gently. "I hoped I'd see you again." Lena felt a flutter of surprise. She hadn't expected him to return. The owner nodded toward him. "Morning, sir. Coffee?" "Please," the man said, then turned back to Lena. "Would you mind if I sat with you for a moment?" She nodded, and they took seats at a small table near the window. The sun warmed the wooden tabletop as he settled into the chair across from her. "I didn't get the chance to say it properly last night," he said, folding his hands. "Your father was a remarkable musician. His music touched many people, myself included. Hearing you play, it brought something back that I didn't realize I'd lost. Lena looked down at her fingers, which rested lightly on the edge of the table. She felt the old ache rise in her chest again. He didn't talk much about his past, she said quietly. He didn't want fame to shape my life. The man nodded slowly. I understand. He was private, but kind, and deeply passionate about music. He paused, studying her face. He would be proud of you. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Lena felt her throat tighten. She swallowed hard, staring out the window at the street beyond. A cyclist rode by. A group of children laughed on the sidewalk, and life carried on as if the world hadn't shifted inside her. He passed on so much beauty through his music. The man continued, and you carry that same beauty, whether you want to or not. It's not a burden. It's a gift. She didn't respond right away. She wasn't sure she could. Her chest felt tight in a way that made it hard to breathe. After a long moment, she said softly, Sometimes I feel like I'm just trying to find where I belong. The man smiled gently. Sometimes the place we belong finds us first. His words lingered in her mind long after he returned to his seat at the counter. She studied the room around her, the warm light, the gentle chatter, the piano waiting quietly on the stage. Everything felt strangely peaceful, like she had stepped into a space that wasn't demanding anything from her. A little while later, the musicians began their rehearsal again. This time, their playing was more careful, more sincere. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were simply trying. When they finished their warm-up, the tall musician turned to her awkwardly. Would you, want to play something with us? He asked, scratching the back of his neck. We could use the kind of sound you bring. His friend nodded eagerly. Yeah, maybe you could teach us a few things. Lena looked at their hopeful expressions and felt a quiet warmth bloom inside her. They weren't mocking her now. They weren't competing. They were reaching out. Sure, she said softly. I can try. They stepped aside to give her space at the piano. She sat down, touching the keys gently, feeling the familiar comfort settle around her. The musicians lifted their instruments, waiting for her signal. She gave them a small nod and began a simple, steady rhythm, something they could follow easily. The guitar joined first, then the second instrument added its own soft notes. The music grew slowly, layer by layer, until it filled the cafe with a warm, calming sound. Customers looked up from their tables, smiling. The owner leaned against the counter, arms crossed, listening with an expression of quiet pride. The older man closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. And for the first time in a long time, Lena didn't feel like she was drifting. She felt like she was part of something small, but real. She didn't know how long it would last. She didn't know where she would go after this town, or how long she would stay. But for this moment, she felt grounded, connected, steady as the music carried through the room. She felt her father's presence again, not as a shadow she had to escape, but as a guiding warmth reminding her she wasn't alone, and she played with a full heart, letting the sound rise and fall like a gentle tide, carrying her and everyone listening into something bright and hopeful. The sunlight had shifted by the time Lena finally stepped outside the cafe. The morning glow had softened into a warm afternoon shimmer, giving the town a gentle, sleepy feeling. She squinted at the brightness for a moment, letting the fresh air settle around her. Her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks, maybe months. But beneath that lightness was a quiet buzz, the kind that came when something in life began to change. She walked slowly down the street, not in any hurry. The town felt different, now that she had seen a bit of its warmth. The bakery on the corner had just set out a tray of fresh pastries, filling the air with a sweet smell. A group of teenagers sat outside a small shop sharing a bag of chips, laughing as though they had no worries at all. A man in a bright scarf rode by on a bike, humming loudly, not caring who heard. Everything seemed peaceful, simple, alive. Lena found a small park a few blocks away and took a seat on one of the benches. The wooden slats were warmed from the sun. In the center of the park, a fountain poured water in a steady trickle, and a few children ran around it, trying to catch the splashes with their hands. She watched them with a soft smile. For a moment, she let herself just breathe. She wasn't used to staying in one place long enough to notice things like this. Most towns she passed through were just temporary points on an endless road. She would play, gather enough money to keep moving, then leave before anyone asked too many questions. But today felt different. She didn't feel the usual pressure to run. She looked down at her backpack resting beside her feet. Inside it were a few clothes, a couple of notebooks filled with unfinished music, and a folded photo she rarely took out. The picture was worn and creased, the edges softened from years of being handled. She didn't open it now, but she felt the shape of it in her mind. Anyway, her father sitting at the old piano, her younger self leaning against his arm, both of them smiling. Her chest tightened a little. She missed him in a way that hadn't faded with time, but today the ache wasn't sharp. It felt gentle, more like a reminder than a wound. As she sat there, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see the tall musician from the cafe, the one who had apologized earlier that morning. He looked out of breath, as if he had been searching for her. Double quotes. "Oh, good," he said, resting his hands on his knees for a moment. "I thought I might have missed you." Lena blinked. "Everything all right?" He straightened up. Yeah, we wanted to ask something. Both of us. But I got sent to find you because I walk faster." She raised an eyebrow. "Ask what?" He rubbed the back of his neck, a little embarrassed. "About the set this weekend. The owner said you might play, but we thought maybe you could play with us? Like a small group performance. We could rehearse together." Lena blinked again, surprised. She had expected maybe a simple thank you or a casual conversation, but not this, he continued, words tumbling out faster now. "We know we're not great, but we're learning, and you helped us a lot earlier. We thought maybe we could keep learning with you, just until the weekend. If you're okay with it." He paused, clearly unsure how she would respond. Lena took a moment to think. She hadn't planned on collaborating with anyone. She usually worked alone. It kept things simple, uncomplicated. But the idea of helping them didn't feel heavy. It felt kind of nice. "I could try," she said softly. His face lit up with relief. "Really? That's great. We'll meet you at the cafe in an hour? We can start then." She nodded, and he jogged off again, leaving her alone with the warm sunlight and the gentle sound of the fountain. She leaned back on the bench, letting the breeze brush across her face. It felt strange to be included, to be invited, not because someone needed something from her, but because they wanted her there. After a while, she stood and walked back toward the cafe. When she arrived, the two musicians were already there, tuning their instruments with serious expressions. The tall one grinned when he saw her, and his friend gave a small wave. They weren't trying to act confident anymore. They looked open. Curious. Lena took her seat at the piano. "Let's start simple," she suggested. They spent the next hour working through a few rhythmic patterns, then a soft melody. The musicians listened carefully, following her cues, nodding whenever something clicked. There was something warm about teaching them, something grounding. She found herself smiling more than she expected. By late afternoon, the cafe had gathered a small audience, not customers, just a few passers-by who stopped to listen through the open door. The owner leaned by the counter, watching with quiet approval. "You three sound good together," he said as they took a short break. The tall musician beamed. His friend almost dropped his instrument from excitement. Lena felt a gentle warmth settle in her chest. She wasn't used to being part of a group like this, but it felt strangely natural. They practiced until the sun began to lower in the sky. When they finally stopped, the musicians looked drained but happy. "Same time tomorrow?" the tall one asked. "Yeah," Lena said. "Tomorrow is fine." As she packed her things, the owner approached her. "Stay for dinner?" he offered. "It's nothing fancy, but you've earned it." Lena hesitated. She didn't want to take advantage of anyone's kindness. But the owner shook his head gently before she even spoke. "It's not payment," he said. "It's just a meal." She nodded slowly. Later, they all sat together at one of the larger tables, the owner, the two musicians, the older man who had recognized her father, and Lena. The plates were filled with warm food, simple but comforting. The conversation was easy and gentle, flowing around her like soft music. The older man asked her a few questions about her travels, but nothing intrusive. The musicians talked about their dream of playing in a bigger city one day. The owner teased them about it, reminding them to focus on tuning their instruments before dreaming about stadiums. Lena laughed quietly. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like an outsider. After dinner, they helped the owner clean up. She wiped down tables while the musicians stacked chairs. The older man swept the floor, humming softly as he worked. When everything was done, the owner locked the doors and wished them all good night. The street outside had grown dim, lit only by the warm glow of a few street lamps. The air had cooled, carrying the soft smell of night flowers from someone's garden. The musicians headed off together, still discussing which part of the song they wanted to fix tomorrow. The older man lingered beside Lena. "You played beautifully today," he said. "Your father would have smiled watching you." Lena looked down. "I hope so." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a comforting gesture. "Be proud of yourself. You're creating your own path." She nodded, feeling her throat tighten for a moment. "Thank you. Get some rest," he said with a small smile. Then he walked off into the quiet night. Lena stood there for a moment, soaking in the peaceful atmosphere. The world felt still, almost soft. She made her way back to the small room she had rented, her steps slow but steady. When she reached her room, she set her bag down and finally pulled out the old photograph. She held it carefully, smoothing the worn edges with her thumb. "I'm trying," she whispered into the quiet room. Her father's gentle smile looked back at her from the picture. She felt something settle inside her, a quiet sense of direction she hadn't felt in a long time. She set the photo on the bedside table and climbed into bed. The sheets were cool and crisp. Outside, a few distant sounds drifted through the night, a dog barking somewhere far away, the low hum of a passing car, the soft rustle of leaves. She closed her eyes. For the first time in many long nights, she fell asleep feeling safe. And for the first time in even longer, she looked forward to tomorrow. The next morning came quietly, with soft light sliding through the thin curtains of Lena's small room. She woke slowly, her eyes adjusting to the pale glow that made everything look calm and still. For a few seconds, she simply lay there, listening to the faint sounds of the town beginning its day. A cart rolled over cobblestones somewhere outside. A door opened and closed. Birds called out to each other from rooftops. It all made her feel strangely settled. She sat up and rubbed her eyes, letting herself take a slow breath. There was no rush today, but there was something different in the air, a sense of anticipation. The weekend performance was only hours away, and even though she had played in many places before, this one felt meaningful in a way she couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't about the stage or the audience. It was the people, the connection, the quiet warmth she had felt the day before. She got dressed, tied her hair back, and grabbed her backpack before heading out into the fresh morning air. The streets were still cool, shadows stretching long across the ground. A few shops were already open, and she could smell bread baking somewhere nearby. A couple walked past her, sipping from steaming cups. A dog trotted along beside its owner, tail wagging lazily. Everything felt gentle. When she reached the cafe, the owner was sweeping the front steps. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "You're early," he said. "Couldn't sleep much," Lena replied. He nodded knowingly. Big days tend to do that. He held the door open for her as she stepped inside. The cafe looked different in the morning, light quieter, softer, almost like it was resting before the busy hours ahead. The tall musician and his friend hadn't arrived yet, so Lena took her place at the piano and gently lifted the cover. Her fingers rested on the keys for a moment. The smooth surface felt familiar, comforting. She played a few soft notes, just warming up, letting her hands remember what they loved to do. The sound echoed lightly in the empty room. A few minutes later, the door jingled and the tall musician walked in. His hair a little messy, as though he had rushed to get there. "There you are," he said with a grin. "We thought we'd beat you today." His friend arrived right behind him, carrying his instrument case and looking half awake. "We should practice a bit more," the tall one said, "just to make sure everything feels smooth." They worked through the same melody they had practiced the day before. At first, the two musicians struggled with a few timing issues, but they listened carefully each time Lena explained something. Slowly, their sound grew stronger, steadier. The owner passed behind them occasionally, nodding approvingly. After about an hour, they took a short break. Lena sat with a cup of water while the musicians argued lightheartedly about which part they wanted to impress the crowd with. "You'll be fine," she said quietly. The tall musician laughed. "You say that like it's easy." "It becomes easy," Lena replied, "when you stop worrying about who's watching and start thinking about what you want them to feel." That made them both pause. They exchanged a look, then nodded. "You think people will feel something when we play?" The friend asked. Lena took a breath. "If you play honestly, they will." The musicians fell quiet for a moment, absorbing that. By midday, the cafe began to transform. The owner set out extra tables, arranged chairs neatly, and placed small candles on each one. The older man who had recognized her father arrived early, offering to help with whatever he could. The musicians tuned and retuned their instruments, pacing nervously between adjustments. The sun dipped lower, casting warm gold through the windows. Crowds began to gather outside long before the performance was scheduled to begin. People talked excitedly, their voices blending into a cheerful hum. When the doors finally opened, the cafe filled quickly. Families, couples, travelers, and locals all settling into chairs, ordering warm drinks and pastries as they waited for the music to start. There was a calm kind of excitement in the room, like everyone knew something special was coming. Lena watched from her place at the piano. She felt the familiar flutter of nerves, but they didn't overwhelm her. Instead, she felt grounded, connected to the moment. The tall musician stepped up beside her. "Look at this crowd," he whispered. "You think we can handle this?" "You can," Lena said gently. He swallowed hard, then gave a shaky smile. The owner dimmed the lights slightly, creating a warm glow around the stage area. The chatter softened. People leaned forward, waiting. The older man sat near the front, a soft and knowing expression on his face. The musicians took their places. Lena rested her hands on the piano keys. The room went quiet, and then the music began. The first notes were soft, almost whispering across the room. The melody carried a gentle rise and fall, like a breath being taken in and released. The musicians followed her lead, their instruments blending with her piano in a warm, steady wave of sound. At first, the musicians were a little stiff, but gradually their movements loosened. Their confidence grew as the music lifted them. They found the rhythm, found the emotion. Lena played with the same gentle force she always had, her expression calm, her eyes half closed. The audience leaned in. Some smiled softly. Others swayed gently in their seats. The cafe felt transformed, as though the music filled every corner of the room with warmth. Halfway through the performance, the tall musician took a brief solo. His hands trembled for a moment, but then he found a strength he didn't know he had. His notes rose with a quiet power, surprising even himself. When he finished, the audience murmured in appreciation. He shot Lena a grateful look. The final piece was a slow, emotional tune, one Lena had learned from her father when she was very young. It was gentle, thoughtful, shaped like a memory. She played it with care, letting the story of the melody unfold naturally. The room fell completely silent. People watched her with deep focus, their expressions softening with each note. When the last chord faded, there was a moment where time seemed to hang still, and then the applause began. It wasn't a loud, explosive cheer. It was warm, full, heartfelt. The kind of applause that wrapped around you like a hug. The musicians stood dazed, staring at the crowd as if they had never imagined such a reaction. The owner wiped his hands on his apron, smiling proudly. The older man had tears in his eyes. When the applause finally quieted, the older man stood. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. His voice carrying across the room. Lena felt her chest tighten, but not in a painful way. She nodded gently. The musicians bowed awkwardly, still stunned by the crowd's reaction. Several people approached them afterward, offering praise and asking when they would play again. The musicians looked overwhelmed but happy. One woman approached Lena directly, her hands clasped. "That last piece, it felt like a memory. Thank you." Lena smiled kindly. "I'm glad it reached you." As the evening went on, the cafe turned lively. People chatted and laughed, replaying their favorite parts of the performance. The musicians sat at a small table together, still buzzing from the experience. The owner made sure Lena had a warm meal waiting for her. When she sat down to eat, he placed a small envelope next to her plate. "What's this?" she asked. "Something small," he said. "A thank you for helping us all tonight." She looked hesitant. "You didn't have to." He cut her off gently. "I know, but I wanted to." She opened the envelope. Inside was a simple handwritten note. "For your kindness, your music, and the warmth you brought into this space. You're welcome here any time." Her eyes softened. She stayed late into the evening, laughing with the others, sharing stories, letting herself feel like part of a small temporary family. When she finally stepped outside, the night air was cool but comfortable. The street was quiet now, lit by gentle lanterns that glowed softly against the dark. The musicians walked with her for a few blocks before heading off toward their homes. They promised to keep practicing, to keep playing, to remember what she taught them. "You helped us more than you know," the tall one said. Lena smiled. "You helped yourselves. I just nudged you." When she reached her room, she placed her backpack on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. She reached inside and pulled out the old photograph of her and her father. She held it for a long moment. The photo had worn edges, faded colors, and a crease running across the middle, but the smiles were still clear. "Thank you," she whispered softly, not entirely sure if she was speaking to the memory or to the music he had given her. She set the picture down gently. Later that night, she lay on the bed, listening to the quiet town breathing around her. She felt peaceful, fulfilled. The road ahead was still open. She would keep traveling. Keep playing, keep learning. But now she carried with her something new, a reminder that kindness could echo, a reminder that music could build bridges, a reminder that even a quiet traveler could leave light behind wherever she went. And with that thought warming her heart, she closed her eyes and drifted into a deep, easy sleep, ready for whatever the next morning would bring.